Now let's take a look at this in the Angular environment and see how we would use this same task object and the constructor pattern over on the Angular side. Now I have a very simple Plunker task management application built already out on Plunker, and if you go to the URL, you'll be able to see the same Plunk that I'm using on your browser. Now I have a very simple task management application that basically just takes a list of tasks and dumps them out to the screen. It only has name and whether or not it's completed. If you go to script.js, you'll see I just have tasks and an array of tasks. And a lot of times, unfortunately, this is kind of the way we build Angular applications. You pull data from an API somewhere, it gives you back an array of items, and we just iterate over those items and dump them out to the screen. And that leads to a couple of problems with everything being in your controller. First of all, controller bloat means my controllers are huge. I've got some services, but really we're not doing much with those other than just pulling things out of an API. And it's not laid out in a very clean and maintainable way. And so let's inject some objects into our Angular application so we can start to pull things apart a little bit and not have everything sitting in our controller. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to take our task object and we're going to put it into Angular. So we'll do a new file and we're going to call it task.js. Same thing we did before. And like all Angular applications, we start out with an IIFE so that we're not injecting anything into the global scope. And we're going to look for our task manager application. Now in this, we're going to use the same task thing that we used before. So we're going to create a function, and that function is going to take the name. And this task is going to look exactly the same way it looked over on the node side. Create a task function, it's got a name, it's got completed, and then we've got our task.prototype has complete and save. The same thing. Now in order to put that into our Angular application, we need to add that to a app factory. So we're going to do app.factory task, what we're naming our object. So in this case, we're naming it task, and then a function, and that's how that works. Now in this case, we're going to wrap our task and our task prototype calls inside this function. And then at the end of this function, we're going to return task. So the same thing we did with module.exports over on the node side, now we're just doing return task on the Angular side. So basically what this does is this loads into Angular a task object. So your task constructor and your task prototype and all of that is now loaded into Angular, and Angular says, hey, I now have a task that is a constructor function and some prototypes. And so now I can use that anywhere that I need to just by letting Angular know I need it. So if I come back over to script.js, I can now tell Angular, hey, this task controller needs a task. And now I can new up tasks this way. Now I'm going to do something a little bit differently. Notice how right here on line 7, I have an object. I've got an array of objects instead of just names. So what we're going to change our task a little bit to match this. I'm going to say new task and pass in the object instead of just the name. So we'll go back and we'll change our task just a little bit because I want to be able to pass in completed as well. Instead of breaking it out into a bunch of different parameters, we're just going to pass in the object. So let's go back over to task and change this up. Here we're going to just say data, and we'll do data.name and data.completed. All right, now back to our script.js. Now I'm using task objects. And my task actually has a complete function. So when I was checking this checkbox, if we go to index.html, I've got an ng-click. I'm using my controller.complete method to complete this task. And I don't need to do that anymore because my task itself, if you look back in task.js, my task has a completed method on itself. So now on my index.html, instead of saying controller.complete $index, I can actually just go task.complete. And now let's run that and see what happens. Now I'm pulling everything back from inside my task instead of in my controller. So my script.js, I can actually get rid of this .complete, completely and just have my tasks deal with all that functionality. If I refresh, notice it stays the same. And just so we know, we'll set that one to false, refresh, and if we look at our console, when I click check, we're getting completing task 2. If you remember, that's my save function on my prototype. So now what I've done is, instead of having all that functionality in my controller, I've moved all of the save and manipulate functionality out of the controller into my task object. And my task controller actually shrunk by about 5 lines of code when I did that. All right, so that's the constructor pattern for Angular and Node. Let's move on and look at a couple others.